cannot believe it. This can't be true. This can't be true. It's a monstrous case because it's the own father who did this to his daughter.
Do you think she knew?
We still do not know what his wife really knew.
She took in 3 babies, one after another, and accepted them.
Yes.
Hey guys, Jason here. Imagine living in a peaceful town, unaware that beneath your neighbor's house lies a secret so dark, it would shock the entire world. This is the story of Josef Fritzl, a man who imprisoned his own daughter for 24 years, right under his family's feet. But how did he get away with it for so long? And what horrors did she and her children endure in that hidden dungeon? In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of this nightmare, piece by piece. And trust me, it's not for the faint of heart. Stick with me as we uncover the chilling details of a crime that went unnoticed for decades. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, Lower Austria. As the only child of Maria and Josef Fritzl Sr., his father, a severe alcoholic, abandoned the family when Josef was just 4 years old, leaving him to be raised solely by his mother. Tragically, Fritzl Sr. died during World War II, fighting for the Nazi Germany's unified armed forces, and his name is now inscribed on a memorial plaque in Amstetten. Fast forward to 1956. At just 21 years old, Josef Fritzl married 17-year-old Rosemarie. At the time, Josef was seen as a reputable and skilled electrical engineer, well respected in the community. But as we'll soon learn, the public image of this man couldn't be further from the truth. In 1967, just over a decade into their marriage, Josef Fritzl's dark and deviant behavior began to surface. He broke into the home of a 24-year-old nurse and brutally raped her at knife point. Fritzl was eventually arrested, but despite the seriousness of the crime, he served only 12 months of his 18-month prison sentence before being released early. Shockingly, this wasn't the only incident. Around the same time, Josef Fritzl was also named as a suspect in the attempted rape of a 21-year-old woman, further revealing the disturbing path his life had taken. Josef also had a history of indecent exposure, yet despite his criminal record, his marriage to Rosemarie persisted. Together, they had 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. In 1966, they welcomed their 4th child, Elisabeth, after already having 2 daughters and 1 son. Elisabeth's childhood was far from easy. Josef's toxic influence affected their daily lives, and he and Elisabeth often found themselves embroiled in frequent arguments that often ended with her being beaten. The physical abuse wasn't limited to Elisabeth, as Josef was also violent towards his wife and all their children. Elisabeth endured the most because she was one of the few who had the courage to challenge her domineering father. Aside from being physically abusive towards her and her siblings, Josef also began sexually abusing Elisabeth when she was 11 years old. After completing her government-required education at age 15, Elisabeth started a course to become a waitress, but before she could complete her course, Elisabeth decided she had endured enough of the abuse at home. In January 1983, she and a co-worker fled to Vienna. The police found her within 3 weeks and returned her to her parents. After her return, she resumed her waitress training and was eventually offered a job in the nearby city of Linz. Elisabeth hoped her life was finally going to improve, but unfortunately, her situation was about to take a much darker turn. Bound for Linz and seemingly out of his control, it was finally time for Josef to put his long-planned scheme into action. On August 28, 1984, shortly after Elisabeth turned 18, Josef deceived her into the basement of their family home by claiming he needed help moving a door. In reality, for the past 6 years, Josef had been constructing what he told his family was an underground fallout shelter. While this might have seemed suspicious to some, the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the USSR had heightened fears of a nuclear threat. With the threat of nuclear warfare ever present, building a fallout shelter in one's home was not unusual. However, Josef's so-called fallout shelter was merely a cover story. On that August night, Elisabeth was about to discover the true purpose of what her father had been constructing. As she helped Josef secure the final door to the area, she held it in place while he tried to fasten it. Just before closing it, he slammed the door in her face, knocking her backward into what was, in reality, a prison. Josef then incapacitated her with an ether-soaked towel. He covered her mouth and waited for her to lose consciousness. This marked the beginning of her new life, a life isolated from society, barely sustained by her captor father. The prison was a small, cleverly concealed room hidden behind a tiny square entrance, equipped with a complex keypad lock that Josef assured only he could operate. Moreover, accessing the final door required navigating through not one, but 8 locked doors within the labyrinth that Josef had constructed. Meticulously planned and constructed, the prison was revealed following Elisabeth's disappearance. Josef and Rosemarie reported their daughter missing to the police, with Josef claiming she had fled to join a cult. He suggested that her growing interest in the occult had foreshadowed her departure. However, Josef was the only one who believed Elisabeth had any interest in such groups, as Rosemarie and other family members saw no signs of it. The police, having confirmed the earlier report of Elisabeth running away with her co-worker, initially considered this context in their investigation. Suspected to have simply run away again, this theory was supported by a letter that Josef had forced Elisabeth to write. In the letter, she expressed her exhaustion with family life and warned her parents not to search for her, or she would leave the country. This letter was the crucial evidence that led the police to believe Elisabeth had left voluntarily, resulting in the case being closed. Meanwhile, Josef visited Elisabeth in the underground prison almost daily, bringing her food and other supplies, starting from her second day of captivity. His visits were a reminder of the false normalcy he attempted to maintain despite the horrific reality she faced. He also visited almost daily to rape her, sometimes multiple times per day. Josef later admitted that he distanced himself from his actions by never looking Elisabeth in the face during these assaults. After 5 years of Elisabeth living alone in the prison, during which Josef rarely spoke to her, having a baby in the cellar was both terrifying and a source of significant distress for Elisabeth, but the presence of the children also offered her much-needed companionship and a renewed sense of purpose after so many years of isolation and suffering. During her 24 years of captivity, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children fathered by Josef, though the reasons behind this remain unclear. Josef chose 3 of these children to live openly upstairs with him, his wife, and the rest of the family. He achieved this by placing each child on the family porch at different times, along with letters he had coerced Elisabeth into writing. In these letters, Elisabeth claimed she was leaving the children for her parents to care for, as she couldn't manage the responsibility of the 4 children remaining with her in the basement. One of these children, born with respiratory issues, died shortly after birth. The remaining 3, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, stayed with Elisabeth in the dungeon. She was denied medical attention and forced to give birth to all 7 children without any professional help. To aid her, Josef provided Elisabeth with disinfectant, a dirty pair of scissors, and an outdated 1960s childbirth manual. When Michael, the child with respiratory issues, died, Josef cremated his body in their oven. Social workers visited the Fritzl residence multiple times due to concerns about the children being left at the doorstep. Josef managed to persuade them with his fabricated story. Despite his efforts, there were clear signs that something was amiss. For instance, when the second child was left on the Fritzls' doorstep, it was Rosemarie who found the baby. She reported to a social worker that just before midnight, she had heard the sound of a baby crying. Given that they had recently changed their home phone number, and no one should have known the new number, the situation seemed increasingly suspicious. Josef's sister-in-law reported that he would go into the basement every morning at 9 a.m., claiming he was working on blueprints and building new machines to sell to clients. He instructed that no one was to disturb him or enter the basement while he was working. Additionally, the Fritzls had rented out a bedroom in their home, which happened to be directly above the basement, further complicating the secrecy surrounding his activities. One of the tenants reported hearing noises at night and brought his concerns to Josef, who consistently assured him that the sounds were merely faulty pipes and settling noises. Another tenant, who lived there for 4 years, observed that his dog would suddenly become alert in the middle of the night, sniffing and growling at nothing. The tenant would search the house for the source of his dog's unease, but never discovered the cellar door or anything of particular concern. Despite his investigations, neither he, his wife, nor his family found any clues to the true nature of the disturbances. None of the numerous tenants over the years grew suspicious enough to report Joseph's unusual behavior, despite his increasingly frequent absences from the main part of the house. He lived in a separate area, apart from his wife, and often claimed he was away on business trips while spending nights in the basement. Tenants even saw him bringing bags of groceries, building materials, appliances, and furniture into the basement. Despite these observations, the tenants did not raise alarms or report any concerns about his actions, even amidst the troubling circumstances. Despite the dire circumstances surrounding the births of her children, Elisabeth did her best to care for the three who lived with her. Investigators and reporters were consistently impressed and inspired by how well she managed to raise her children under such harsh conditions. Elisabeth asked Josef to bring her books regularly, so she could teach the children to read and write. She also made sure they learn about the outside world and its culture through the television and radio that Josef permitted. In 1994, after Elisabeth gave birth to a fourth child, Josef permitted the cramped 380-square-foot prison to be expanded to 590 square feet, making it about 50% larger. The expanded space included a narrow 16-foot corridor, a storage area, and 3 small open cells connected by narrow passageways. It also featured 2 sleeping areas with 2 beds each, bathroom facilities, and a basic cooking area. The ceilings were so low that they reached only between 5 feet 6 inches and 6 feet, making the space feel even more confined. Some areas of the expanded space had ceilings up to 6 feet at their highest point, which caused difficulties for Stefan, who grew to 5 feet 8 inches but had to stoop almost constantly to move around. To achieve the extension, Josef compelled the underground family to dig through the walls with their bare hands. He warned them that touching the inside of the cellar door would electrocute them, and that any escape attempt would result in instant gassing. While police confirmed there was no gas supply to the basement, the threat served to keep them in fear and deter any attempts to escape. It was likely a scare tactic intended to keep the family in line. Josef resorted to other forms of punishment for even the slightest disobedience. In addition to the ongoing physical and sexual abuse, he would cut off all power to the cellar or withhold food and water, forcing Elisabeth and her children to endure hunger, thirst, and total darkness for days at a time. On April 19, 2008, the nightmarish prison was only a week away from being the home of Elisabeth and her 3 children. That day, 19-year-old Kirsten, one of Elisabeth's 3 children still with her at the time, fell unconscious for the first time ever. Josef, heeding Elisabeth's plea that medical attention was urgently needed, allowed her outside to help him carry Kirsten to the car. It was the first time Elisabeth had seen the outside world in 24 years. After placing Kirsten in the car, Josef locked Elisabeth back in the dungeon with the other children and drove to the local hospital. Upon arrival, the doctors were immediately alarmed by Kirsten's condition, as her skin was ghostly pale, so white that her veins were clearly visible, and some even remarked that it was almost transparent. Clearly puzzled, the doctors requested Kirsten's name to search for her and her family's medical history, only to find that her name was absent from the database. She seemed to have no official record. Upon examination, doctors discovered that Kirsten was in critical condition, suffering from severe kidney failure and several other serious medical issues. Issues caused by a severe vitamin D deficiency. Josef nervously told the doctors that Kirsten was one of his granddaughters, but her even younger age heightened their concern further. The doctors insisted that they needed to contact the mother to understand the situation better. As the doctors grew increasingly suspicious and frustrated with Josef, he avoided answering most critical questions or gave evasive responses, which only fueled their doubts about his story. Mounted, they decided to alert the police. On April 21st, the police issued a public appeal for Elisabeth to come forward to provide Kirsten's medical history and reopened her missing persons case from years earlier. Josef maintained his story that Elisabeth had joined a cult and even produced another letter he had forced her to write from January of that year, The police consulted a cult expert who expressed serious doubts about both the letter and Joseph's story, seemingly dictated an oddly written letter, as well as the alleged cult which the expert believed was unlikely to exist. Meanwhile, Elisabeth pleaded with Josef to let her go to the hospital. On April 26th, Josef permitted Elisabeth to accompany him to the hospital, under strict orders to adhere to the fabricated story or face severe repercussions. He also allowed the 2 remaining children to be taken to the upstairs home while they went to the hospital. Upon arrival, Josef and Elisabeth were immediately detained by police and separated for questioning. Elisabeth was initially hesitant and fearful, speaking softly and avoiding eye contact. The doctors and authorities first suspected that Elisabeth might be an abusive mother and that her treatment and neglect of Kirsten could be the cause of her health issues. However, they soon began to question this theory when they noticed that Elisabeth herself exhibited the same ghostly features: white hair and pale skin. Elisabeth remained uncooperative until the police granted her. Her sole request was to never see her father again. Once the police agreed, she disclosed everything over the following hours, recounting her 24 years of captivity. This included harrowing details about a hidden dungeon and a relentless physical and sexual abuse she endured, which began even before her imprisonment. She spoke of multiple children, some of whom were taken from her, and shared unimaginable experiences, such as being forced to watch adult films and then reenact them with him in front of their children, all intended to humiliate her and traumatize the children. Police compelled Josef to provide the key code to his electronic lock and swiftly began their investigation of the home and basement that same night. Josef, 73 years old at the time, was arrested and taken into custody. 3 days later, on April 29th, DNA evidence confirmed that Elisabeth was telling the truth and that all 6 of her remaining children were biologically Joseph's. The police also planned to interview every individual who had rented the extra bedroom in the house, as the number of former tenants who could shed light on Joseph's behavior was substantial. During the investigation, police discovered numerous letters that Josef had forced Elisabeth to write. One of these letters suggested that he planned to release her from the basement the following year. The letter stated that while Elisabeth wanted to come home, it was not yet possible. Police believed, and Josef confirmed, that his plan was to free Elisabeth, but to claim publicly that he had rescued her from the cult she had supposedly joined. Once police began interrogating him, he confessed to everything. He claimed that he was leading a double life with his daughter in the basement, and that, while he had forced her into captivity, the details of their relationship were consensual. He argued that the media had portrayed him as a monster, but insisted that, in reality, he and his second family enjoyed their time together and had a good relationship. When questioned by the police, he admitted to all the allegations. According to him, he had maintained a parallel life in the basement with his daughter. While he acknowledged that he had kept her captive, he argued that their relationship was consensual. He claimed that the media had unfairly labeled him as a monster, asserting instead that he and his second family had a harmonious existence and enjoyed their time together. Despite these misleading claims, Josef admitted that he had a lingering awareness of the wrongness of his actions. However, he had become so accustomed to his hidden life underground that he no longer cared. He confessed that his motivation for imprisoning Elisabeth in the basement stemmed from a rebellion during her teenage years, believing he needed to protect her from the outside world, even if it meant doing so by force. Although he portrayed himself as a protector, his statements were inconsistent, revealing a complex mix of denial and justification for his actions, reflected a starkly different reality. He conceded that the years of confinement without sunlight or medical care had severely damaged Elisabeth's health. He noted, with a disturbing lack of empathy, that despite her suffering, Elisabeth never complained, even as her teeth deteriorated and fell out one by one. Josef acknowledged that she endured constant pain and sleepless nights due to the severe dental issues. By the time Elisabeth reached the hospital, every one of her teeth had painfully rotted away. Josef admitted that the reason he kept Elisabeth hidden for so long was partly due to his own twisted sense of control and justification for the abusive conditions he imposed on her. Joseph's obsession with control was evident in his motivation to force Elisabeth into bearing multiple children. He sought to possess her like property, ensuring that his dominance extended to every aspect of her life. His twisted plan was to impregnate her as often as possible, hoping that the sheer number of children would intimidate any potential future partners, thereby increasing the chances that Elisabeth would return to him out of desperation. This strategy reflected his deep-seated need to maintain control and reinforce his power over her. Even during Joseph's incarceration, he remained fixated on his manipulative schemes, reflecting a chilling determination to maintain his hold over Elisabeth and their children. He had a prior conviction and admitted to planning to imprison his daughter in order to contain and express his darker impulses. After his arrest, analysts reported that he expressed a chilling sentiment, stating, "I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than locking up my daughter." Analysts noted that Joseph's deviant behavior was likely influenced by his upbringing, which included a toxic environment created by parents who abandoned him. Although Joseph initially spoke highly of his mother, he eventually came to terms with a negative impact of his childhood on his actions. Joseph's complex relationship with his mother reveals a darker side of his past. He resented her deeply, harboring a profound hatred that manifested in severe physical abuse. She would often beat him mercilessly, leaving him in his own blood, and even compared him to Satan. Despite this intense fear and hatred, Joseph allowed her to move into his home with Rosemarie in 1959. However, the dynamics shifted, and his mother found herself subjected to Joseph's abusive behavior. This ongoing mistreatment eventually led Joseph to confine her in the attic, falsely claiming she had died, until her actual death occurred. Police now believe this troubling history of abuse significantly influenced Joseph's later actions and mindset. Joseph's mother could have been imprisoned for nearly 20 years before she passed away in captivity. To honor Elisabeth's request to never see her father again, she provided videotape testimony, which was presented to Austrian prosecutors and investigators in July 2008. Later that month, Joseph's trial commenced. He faced a potential 10-year sentence for the negligent homicide of Michael, the infant who died shortly after birth. Additionally, he faced up to 20 years for charges of rape, incest, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and enslavement. On the first day of the trial, Joseph pleaded guilty to all charges except for the negligent homicide and aggravated assault, which stemmed from his threats to gas his captives if they disobeyed him. His defense attorney urged the jury to separate their emotions from the facts, arguing that Joseph was not a monster. As evidence of his purported kindness, the attorney highlighted that Joseph had brought a Christmas tree down to the dungeon during the holidays. In contrast, the prosecution argued for a life sentence in a psychiatric institution, demonstrating with wall markings how the low ceilings in the basement had affected the captives, during which the jury was presented with extensive evidence of the dungeon's conditions. The prosecution illustrated the oppressive environment of the cellar, showing how cramped, damp, and moldy it was. They passed around musty objects from the dungeon, making the jurors recoil from the unpleasant smell. Elisabeth's taped testimony, which amounted to nearly 11 hours split into 2-hour segments due to its distressing nature, revealed the full extent of her suffering. Her brother also testified about the abuse Joseph inflicted, but Rosemarie and the other children from the cellar chose not to participate in the trial. Elisabeth attended the second day of the trial, showing her strength and determination despite the immense pain of reliving her ordeal. Elisabeth had attended the trial in disguise the previous day, preparing for a book she planned to write about her experiences. However, on the second day, Joseph recognized her presence in the courtroom. The sight of Elisabeth visibly affected him. He went pale and broke down. The following day, Joseph approached the judge and changed his plea to guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a possibility of parole after 15 years. Joseph accepted the sentence and announced he would not appeal. Once the trial concluded, Elisabeth and her 6 children were provided with new identities and relocated to a secure home where they could enjoy their freedom while maintaining privacy. All 6 children require ongoing therapy due to the trauma they experienced. The older children were deeply affected not only by Joseph's abuse, but also by the painful realization that he had lied to them about their mother abandoning them. Meanwhile, the younger children faced the evident trauma of being deprived of normal developmental experiences, such as fresh air and sunshine, in addition to enduring severe mental, physical, and sexual abuse. After the trial, Elisabeth and her 6 children were granted new identities and relocated to a safe home where they could enjoy their freedom while maintaining privacy. However, all 6 children may face genetic issues due to being born from an incestuous relationship. Elisabeth allows her 3 children, who grew up in Josef and Rosemarie's house, to visit their grandmother regularly. Initially, Elisabeth was estranged from her mother for believing her father's false narrative about her whereabouts and not questioning it. Over time, she forgave her mother, and they have since built a strong relationship. In 2013, work began to fill the basement of their new home, symbolizing a step toward healing and moving forward from their traumatic past. The old Fritzl home was eventually filled with concrete to erase the memory of the horrific confinement that took place there. 3 years later, the property was sold and transformed into apartments. Josef Fritzl was placed in a specialized unit for the criminally insane at Austria's Kremstein prison, where he is serving his life sentence. In May 2017, Josef Fritzl changed his name to Josef Mehrhoff, reportedly due to altercations in prison, including one that resulted in several of his teeth being knocked out. In an interview conducted by British journalist Mark Perry, Josef Fritzl reportedly displayed no remorse for his heinous crimes. He was quoted as saying, "Just look into the cellars of other people. You might find other families and girls down there." This chilling statement reflects his continued lack of contrition. By April 2019, Fritzl's health had significantly deteriorated. He was suffering from dementia and had expressed a desire to no longer live. It was reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn, isolating himself from both his fellow inmates and prison staff, who in turn had little interest in interacting with Austria's most notorious convict. In 2021, a regional court ordered that the 87-year-old Fritzl undergo a psychiatric evaluation to assess his mental state and determine the appropriate measures for his care. In 2021, a regional court ordered that the 87-year-old Josef Fritzl be transferred from his psychiatric prison to a standard penitentiary. This decision was based on a psychiatric report indicating that Fritzl no longer posed a threat. However, this ruling was contested by a higher regional court in Vienna, which found no compelling evidence that Fritzl had ceased to be a danger. Consequently, the court determined that he should remain in a secure psychiatric facility. Had Fritzl been successfully moved to a standard prison, he would have been eligible to apply for parole after serving 15 years of his sentence. This eligibility for parole was scheduled to begin in 2023. As of 2023, Josef Fritzl remains in a psychiatric prison and is currently ineligible for parole. The story of Elisabeth and her children is a heartbreaking reminder of the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. It's hard to grasp the depth of pain they endured, but their resilience is truly inspiring. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Also, support me through PayPal donation in the description. Thank you so much for watching.